Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Adam Smith. I'm the project manager with the OpenClim project. So we'll get the session started and I'll hand over to Richard Dawson from Newcastle University.
Good morning everybody. Thank you. Thanks very much, Adam. So my name's Richard Dawson. I'm based at Newcastle University. I'm one of the co-investigators of the OpenClim project. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all today to this first session of our showcase event where we launch and update everyone on what we've been doing over the last couple of years. This morning's session, we're going to keep it high level, focused on the overarching findings and the kind of framework itself that has been developed. First, we'll hear from Suraj Desai, the lead or the head of the UK Climate Resilience Programme at Leeds University, before hearing from three of my colleagues from the OpenClim research team. Robert Nichols, the principal investigator and lead of the project, Rachel Warren, and then Paul Sayers. Then we'll hear from Jim Hall, who is based at Oxford University, but he has been the chair of our International Advisory Board over the last couple of years, and he's going to provide some reflections both from that perspective, but also as a former member of the Climate Change Committee, and think about what OpenClim might mean for the future of national scale risk assessment. And I think that's quite an important point to bear in mind today, that this morning at about 10 o'clock, the Climate Change Committee launched their latest biannual review of the government's progress on adaptation. The headline, for those of you who haven't read it yet, is not good enough, I think is fair to say. But one of the things that struck me from that report was, which I should declare, so I was a co-author of it as well, but so I do know what's in it, was that some sectors across the country are still unable to make even a basic assessment of their risks and progress in adaptation. So I think that the work that OpenClim is doing is especially timely in starting to provide a much more coherent national basis for risk assessment. And I hope you take away a lot of what we've achieved today and can see the potential future benefits of this programme as well, and that longer term legacy. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Suraj to introduce the Climate Resilience Programme. Thank you, Suraj.
Okay. No, I think I'm good. Not using slides for a change. Thanks, Rich. I think it's been a very busy day for the CCC. I was able to capture a bit of the announcements earlier. So there's a lot to do in adaptation, clearly. But a very warm welcome to all of you. It's fantastic to see so many of you in person. So as Rich said, I'm Suraj Desai. I'm one of the champions of the UK Climate Resilience Programme, and my colleague Kate Lonsdale is here as well, and she'll be chairing a session a bit later. So the UK Climate Resilience Programme is sort of coming to an end, sadly, but it's really what's funded this particular project. So I'm just going to tell you a few brief words about UKCR, and then also a little bit about the background to OpenClim, and kind of, yeah, what you know, a preview of what you're about to hear from our colleagues in the Tyndall Centre. So the UKCR programme was funded through the Strategic Priorities Fund, and so one of the key things it was trying to do was to actually align research with government priorities. And a particularly important one that was talked about today through the CCC was the National Adaptation Programme, but another one that is cyclical is the climate change risk assessment. So that's done every 5 years. And that was one of the main things that the UKCR programme, for example, was responding to. The programme was funded through UKRI and then also through the Met Office in the tune of about £19 million. We had a bit over 60 projects, of which OpenClim was the largest, actually. So one of our flagship projects. And one of the key things, I guess, that myself and Kate and others in the steering committee discussed early on is that we really needed a step change in our capability as a nation to produce climate change risk assessments. Because the first one and the second one, for example, was very much done reviewing the literature. And the third one was similarly done in the same way. So the purpose really was to try to think through, what do we need to push forward in terms of our climate change risk assessment capability. And just rewinding briefly in terms of the call, because Robert and colleagues responded to a particular call. So I'm just going to highlight 4 areas where I think the OpenClim responded very well, and I think we've made a lot of progress. So one of the things we wanted to do was to have better integration of climate impact models and put through them drivers of both socioeconomic change and climate change. And again, throughout the day, you're going to see many examples of multiple impact models that do that and are integrated in Daphne at the moment. That's the platform where a lot of this resides. The other ask was to produce a new spatially explicit climate impact model. And again, I think you've done that through the health work. That's a new model that's actually spatially explicit, because spatially explicit risk information was something that both the CCC and government were particularly interested in getting for CCRA4 and beyond. And then the final 2 areas, again, which I think you've made quite a lot of progress that the call asked for, was the assessment of effectiveness of adaptation strategies. So again, I think you're going to hear that from Paul, Ali, and others, actually testing adaptation strategies in this modeling framework to, figure out how much risk reduction do we get, and I guess conceivably you could go down in the future all the way to the economics. The final area, which hopefully, again, will come out, is probably around interconnected risks. And I'm sure you've also made some progress there in terms of trying to figure out what are the different interconnected risks. So overall, I'm really looking forward to hearing how much progress you've made. And in particular, I guess it'll be good to discuss later how this can feed into CCRA4, which is moving swiftly into planning right now, but then also informing the implementation of NAP3 and CCRA4 as well. Final plug, I hope you can all stay until the end. We have Professor Steve Scott-Bottoms here with us, and he was one of our embedded researchers, so that was a different funding stream of UKCR. He was our embedded researcher at Leeds City Council, and he developed a performance all around who you're going to call in the case of a climate emergency. So I hope you can stay until the end. And I think I'll hand over to you, Robert, to tell us about the key achievements of OpenClim. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Siraj. I'm Robert Nichols, based at the University of East Anglia in the Tyndall Centre. And I think Siraj has very well set out the problem we are trying to tackle in OpenClim. Really, we've got the foundation of 3 climate change risk assessments and national adaptation plans, and thinking how can we move forward in terms of bringing in different models, being consistent with the models and joining them up, and thinking through things like adaptation, really. How can we, if we identify a risk, how can we, to what extent can we respond to that risk? And it's been touched on with the CCC report today. So OpenClim is a consortium of universities and research organizations. So UEA and Newcastle are sort of the main partners in OpenClim, and we're both members of the Tyndall Centre, so that's the Tyndall Centre part, but we brought in other partners as well. University of Bristol, they were looking at the issue of heat. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, looking at agriculture. Daphne and the Science and Technology Facilities Council, they were dealing with legacy and how we, and the workflows, structure, etc. And then Paul Sayers and partners looking at flooding. So that's the OpenClim consortium. And if we look at our goal, it was really how can we, an assessment method is kind of quite clear in the call. It was an assessment method for CCRA4 and beyond. I mean, I think this is a process. So it's not, CCRA4 is not the end, there'll be CCRA5, etc. So it's ongoing, it's something we want to be able to build and to grow and to enhance our capacity as a nation to look at climate risks and adaptation choices. So that's the overall goal. The vision then really is about sort of integrated assessment and bringing together risk and adaptation models from multiple sectors and in an open framework. So we're trying to build something here that is drawing as much as possible on what exists. We're improving on it, linking it together, and making it as open as we can. And really informing the science and policy development, really, obviously with informing CCRA4. And then the innovation really is consistent and spatially explicit results. So we want to be producing maps, and I think also considering adaptation. And it's not written down there, but I think because we're fundamentally working with sort of process and physics-based sort of models, they can be reconfigured to answer new questions as well. So they're flexible and adaptable, so they can evolve to the science policy environment and the questions change. And when I talk, OpenClim is a project. It ends at the end of August 2023. But it's also a vision as well of something bigger. And clearly, without the vision, the OpenClim project doesn't make much sense because we're thinking about something that goes on beyond the life of this August 2023 funding. So to give you a structure, so the framework. So we sort of started with this picture and we've kept it throughout. So it sort of stood the test of time over 3 years and the COVID pandemic. Because I must say, some members of the team, we've only met very recently in person. We've had a lot of meetings on Teams, and Zoom a little bit, but more on Teams. But we have gone through that COVID time. And the first thing is obviously climate scenarios. And again, we're sort of agnostic to climate, but we are using UKCP 18, but other climate scenarios could be used there. And then socioeconomic scenarios. So the UK SSPs again, but again, you could bring in other views of the socioeconomic future. Then the climate scenarios move on. That leads to changes to hazard, and socioeconomic scenarios lead to changes to vulnerability and exposure. And that feeds on down into risk assessment. And we have a suite of models that you'll be hearing about that look at the different sort of risks there. And then lastly, and this is ongoing, some synthesis, natural capital in the economy. So this is work in progress that we won't be talking about today. And then adaptation. I think we want to stress adaptation because we recognize that adaptation can happen at multiple scales. It can happen in all kinds of ways. And one would think that when we look at the future, we'll probably end up doing portfolios of adaptation. It's unlikely we'll do one thing and that will solve all the problems. And because of those different scales, we recognize we can look at adaptation at the scale of maybe the risk assessment, an individual house, or we can look at changes in the catchment, for example, if we're talking about flooding. So, and then we think the models in OpenClim can handle all those different scales, so we can examine adaptation portfolios. This is illustrating the different themes that we looked at. This is not a CCRA4. I mean, we're illustrating the process. We're not doing a national risk assessment. And we covered sort of 6 themes here. Urban development, which is fundamentally taking the socioeconomic scenarios and turning them into, looking at the vulnerability and exposure into sort of exposure units that we, then we also looked at agriculture, biodiversity, flooding in different forms, heat stress, and drought and water supply. And then in green, I won't read it out, but you can see the different models that we're using in the project. We did a lot of work with stakeholders. Despite COVID, we had lots of online meetings, and we consulted with what would stakeholders really want. And so this is specified from that process that they wanted warming levels of 2 and 4 degrees, a strong focus on SSP2 and SSP4, but others if they're available, and time steps up to 2080. So that's how you'll see the information presented today structured. And lastly, legacy is really important. And I think many of the people working in OpenClim had been involved in projects in the past that looked at integrated assessment. And when we were writing the OpenClim proposal, we reflected on the legacy of those projects, which is we always learn things, but sometimes the software is not as available after the project ends as it might be. So Daphne provides a legacy in terms of, well, it provides a structure in terms of the workflow structure, so operationally how we build what we're doing in OpenClim, but it also provides a legacy for the data and the models. Daphne will last beyond OpenClim. And the geographic coverage, well, it's specified by the terms of reference. It's a national assessment. So we're talking about the United Kingdom. And also, of course, the devolved administrations, so who deal with the issue of adaptation. But I think it's very exciting when you start to think about providing detailed spatial results, that you can start to think about, well, what if we have libraries of all these results, how can they be used in new and exciting ways? And so we've also looked at the subnational, and we started off with the Clyde and Norfolk as places we didn't do anything more there, but we did scrutinize the results more closely, and we discussed them with stakeholders. And that's grown, and we're actually working now, we're looking at the Highland Council, where we're actually involved with an active risk assessment, and Northern Ireland, where we're looking at Northern Ireland as a whole. So this just illustrates that when you start to have these large libraries of results, the different types of things that might be possible. And we want to sort of develop that further, for sure. Outputs, again, quite a lot of information on this slide. If you look, I suppose it gives you the scales at which we're working. The coarser scale is 12 kilometers in the heat work. The urban flooding is actually working at 2 meters. That's the model resolution. We're outputting those results at 1 kilometer, so we're not actually presenting the full results in terms of spatial detail, because we don't, issues of blight, etc., and accuracy. And so that sort of summarizes the information. We have UK coverage in most cases, but in some cases it's not been possible to have UK coverage. And then the others are really addressing the stakeholder requirements. One thing we did, I think, again, it's a result, but it's sort of not really a model result, but it's a very important result, is an adaptation inventory. So we actually have created an online database using particularly the adaptation power reports as the main source of information, which has identified 360 examples of on-the-ground adaptation in the UK. And that's been written up, and that's fully available for anybody that's interested in adaptation. So thinking about next steps and the legacy of OpenClim before we move on to the results. Well, the project ends in August 2023. I think I've already said that. And so over the coming months, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be completing our results database. We're going to be doing a lot of work on data visualization. So we've got data, but I think we recognize that it's really important that you're able to see it, and that's going to really increase the value of what we've done. We're also planning to train stakeholders to assess the models and results, and that will be discussed. That'll be available to book in the World Cafe after lunch, and obviously producing reports and papers. But I made the point about OpenClim being the vision, and obviously there's, then we move on beyond that. Suraj touched on the point about this work being used for CCRA4, but we're also in discussions with the Met Office about them bringing some of their models into OpenClim. We're talking with the Environment Agency flood modelers, again, having exploratory discussions. And so anybody who's here who has ideas or thoughts on things that they would like to do with OpenClim, using the data, bringing in new models, whatever, please discuss that with us, and we'd love to sort of work with you on that. So now I'll move on, and I'll sort of start to give some of the key results, and then my colleagues Rachel Warren and Paul Sayers will then sort of follow me, and sort of between the three of us, we'll cover the suite of things that we've done in OpenClim. And I'll start with sort of urban risks. And so the picture here is the UK SSP. So we now have these downscaled socioeconomic scenarios which give populations for local authority areas for different views of the future. So for SSP3, if you look at the sort of black plot, those are the national numbers and the devolved administration numbers. The yellow's actually the change in the UK population. SSP3, hardly any change at all. SSP5, you've got nearly 50 million more people in the country. Then the maps actually show the distribution of those for SSP2 and SSP4 so you can see where the population has been allocated. And then we have the problem when we're thinking about risk assessment and adaptation. What does that mean, particularly for the built environment? So with the urban development model, we've actually downscaled those population changes and actually translated that into the demand for buildings and associated infrastructure, so we can look at the effects on risk. And so we start off then showing Scotland here with the populations from the UK SSPs, and then we look at the issue of the suitability. What areas are most suitable? And for each SSP, there's a narrative, a storyline about how the priorities of that world. So we've interpreted those storylines and actually developed different realizations of each SSP to reflect that. So but we end up with areas that are suitable or unsuitable, and sort of the panel 2 is sort of showing that suitability score. Moving on for one particular SSP, moving on into 3, then you see the the growth in urban areas, the red areas, reflecting that. And again, you can't build on an existing urban area, but you can build around it, or you might potentially build on open space within it as well. That's another possibility. And then you need that's saying what are the urban areas, and then in step 4 we go to the building density. We actually sort of downscale that at 1 hectare grids to actual building configurations and building types. And this sort of, again, sort of stepping out, just comparing SSP2 and SSP4, SSP2 is a very constrained future, so there are many places you cannot build. You can see, it's hard to see the areas in England that you can build, really, except in 1 or 2 cases at this scale, but if you zoom in, there are some small areas. SSP4, much more open, much freer. And then if you go to, say, London, which is the two panels, you actually can look at, you have a demand for population in each London borough, and what this emerges is SSP2, there's very little land available, so if you're going to put, you have to have very high densities to accommodate the people that the SSP scenario is suggesting will be there, compared to SSP4. So you get very different sort of outcomes. And then in the urban fabric generator, this sort of relationship is taken, which actually takes the density here, and as the density increases, so the mix of buildings changes, reflecting this paper, which sort of has sort of mapped these out, and you then actually, for each 1 hectare, you look at the buildings, the roads, the green space, so we get a synthetic view of what it would look like for impact assessment. If we look at, so this is now Newcastle, and SSP2, SSP4, and SSP5, that's the one with the very large population growth, and I think you can self-evidently see that very clearly on this slide. We have quite large expansions in population. You can see the numbers there. For example, SSP2, about 20% growth in population. In terms of, but then when we look at the growth because of density considerations, that doesn't necessarily translate into the same growth in the number of buildings. And so for SSP2 and SSP5, the building growth is lower, reflecting that those buildings are packing a lot of people into them, shall we say. SSP4, in fact, it's the opposite because you have got a lot more space. So that's very important. So we've got this consistent view across the project of the urban form and how it's evolving with time. And so every model is looking at that consistent urban form. And I'll now move just to an illustration of city flooding. And it's drawing on Newcastle, so it's building on the slides I showed you. And this is the CityCat model, and it's showing an event an extreme event over 1 hour. So these are basically, you're going around here with sort of 15-minute time steps over the 1 hour. And you can watch there how, this is working at 2-meter resolution, and you can watch the build-up with time of the areas that have been inundated. And of course, we also have the flood depth. And you can then actually see what of the existing built environment and the new built environment is being impacted by that event. And if we move on, we can sort of see this is purely with socioeconomic change. So this is the increase in damages due to new development. So we're assuming the climate in these runs are stationary. And you can see and we're looking at SSP 2 and 4 in 2050 and 2080. And you can see the effects are in the range of 1 to 6%, depending on the scenario that you're looking at. Then, if we introduce, so again, the top left panel there is again showing SSP2 with no climate change. If we move across to the furthest panel at the top, 2050, there you see with climate change, and so it's a much bigger effect. It's a 29% effect increase in damages as compared to a 4% just due to new build in SSP2. Put them together, it's 34%. And then, of course, I made the point that in OpenClim we want to think about adaptation. So, again, this is an illustration of an effect. So, if you then made all the pavements, change them to permeable surface, what effect would that have by sort of building regulations over time? And the damages are then going up about 22%. So you're having a significant, you haven't ameliorated all the damages, but that change has had a significant effect. Moving on now to a sort of hotter, drier UK, looking really at heat and drought. So heat-related mortality is projected to increase with climate change, but again, that was mentioned by Suraj. And I think as well as climate change, increases in population is quite important, particularly when we go to the 2080s. And you can sort of see the numbers here with 2 degrees in 2050, 2 degrees in 2080, and 4 degrees in 2080. And there's very large increases, particularly with SSP5, because we have the largest increase in population, but it's happening across the piece, and maybe almost in under 4 degrees with the socioeconomics, you're almost getting an order of magnitude effect. With, although there's no acclimatization in these results, so these are direct application of results. If we look at the what's causing this, the results here are not looking at particular events, they're looking at the mortality in a season. And here we have a graph that shows degree warming above the threshold at which mortality starts. And it brings out the point that actually most people are dying in events that are only 3, 4, 5 degrees above that threshold. And the very extreme events, probably the events that get in the press, but they're actually not killing as many people. So that, so it's looking at the integration of the effect. Maps are very important, so we can actually start to look at these results in a spatially explicit way. And not surprisingly, the issues are greatest in southern and central England. But you can see that with time, there's a sort of a northerly movement. And so you start to see problems, for example, emerging in the central belt of Scotland, with mortality happening there. And the numbers, still overwhelmingly, most people are the biggest problems in England, but you can see that in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, with 4 degrees, there are significant increases in deaths. And then adaptation for heat-related mortality. I think this is a really important question for CCRA4, really, about how do people acclimatise to heat? Because I think they do, but to what extent will these be offset? And this is just showing the effects of essentially arbitrary changes. So people can tolerate a 1 degree or a 2 degree rise in temperature. So, you know, what that might mean, whether that's physiological change or they buy air conditioners, it's not explicit. So it's just, but illustrating that we can look at these, and I think this is really important because it will mean that the impacts are less. And how much will happen autonomously, and then how much can we affect by policy. And then in terms of heat and labour productivity, we can look at the effects of this as well. And with acclimatisation, taking acclimatisation into effect, it's really a problem that emerges after 4 degrees of warming. And again, you can see that it's a problem in really mainly in England. So it's following the patterns that we've seen in the other slides. If we didn't get acclimatization, then we would get we would get bigger impacts. Moving on quickly now. So in terms of drought, I think the numbers. Basically, we have 2 models in drought. We're looking at SHE-TRAN and HBV, so we're actually comparing models, so you've got 2 results. And they're showing a very similar pattern, that as we get rising temperature, so we get an increase in severe droughts, in the number of severe droughts. There are differences between the models. And we can see the spatial pattern, and so everywhere is getting worse, really. If we look at the duration of droughts, again, the 2 models, there is an increase in duration. It's stronger in the SHE-TRAN model over HBV. And we can see in the sort of east and the south, there seem to be more longer droughts. Although, you know, different catchments differ, and you can note some of the catchments in the top of Scotland are showing significant changes. And lastly, meteorological drought, and again, this is this both in terms of number per year and the duration, 2 to 4 degrees. You know, it's getting significantly increasing over the country. And my last slide now, water supply. So one of the benefits in OpenClim, we're talking about linking two models together, and we're talking about using Daphne and the RU model. The water resources, the Environment Agency's water resources model for England and Wales is used fundamentally for looking at water supply issues, but in OpenClim, it's a physics-based model, so in OpenClim we're asking new questions of that. This is work that's ongoing, but looking at the 2040s and 2070s, looking at different types of environmental ambition, different levels of adaptation, and really beginning to make that model, I think, available to CCRA in a way that it isn't, learning how it can be used for those types of assessments. So with that then, I'll stop and I'll pass over to Rachel Warren, who'll take you further forward with OpenClim.
So I'm going to continue the presentation by talking about the risks to rural environments. So Robert just covered the urban environment. All of this work is spatially explicit, but unlike the work on the urban environment, it's based, what I'm going to show, these examples are entirely based on the climate change scenarios and not on the shared socioeconomic pathways. So we're looking in what I'm going to show at the physical effects of climate change on agriculture and the environment. Richard Pywell, John Redhead and Matt Brown provided the work on agriculture, and Jeff Price, Nicole Falstenhausler and myself are responsible for the biodiversity contribution. So agriculture first looked at yield projections, and these examples are focusing on wheat and perennial ryegrass, because those are the 2 most important crops that are grown in the country by either the amount of crop that's produced or the amount of land that is used to produce it. And the CropNet models produce the maximum achievable yield, which means is determined completely by climatic constraints, no effect of fertilizer limitation, no account of pests, diseases, variety, or agronomy. What these models do include is water limitation, heat stress, and CO2 fertilization, but importantly, doesn't include associated declines in nutrient and protein content that accompanies CO2 fertilization. It's based on UK CP18 models. This was combined with CEH's Chesscape to produce 1 by 1 kilometre projections of the climate, taking into account a daily time series of changes in climate. And 30-year time slices are extracted around the levels of warming that the project focuses on, i.e. 2 and 4 degrees in the 2080s and 2 degrees in the 2050s. And in this case, they were also combined for each ensemble member with the CO2 concentration profile to properly account for CO2 fertilization. In the results that I'm about to show, it does not account for the possibility of growing crops in new areas because of climate change. We'll come on to that later, but this is just looking at where the crops are growing now and what is projected to happen. And also because these are 30-year time slices, it means that interannual variability is averaged out. So here you can see potential wheat yields. The one on the left is our baseline period 1980 to 2010, which agrees well with the DEFRA's records. So the model is being used to simulate the past. And we can see higher yields in the southwest. And then as climate changes, you can see on the right-hand two slides for 2 and 4 degrees are the reductions in yield in the blue areas expected. So these are potential yield differences in tonnes per hectare. And so you can see particularly large changes in yield. So these are increases in yield shown in the blue and some decreases that you can see in the red. By the time you get to 4 degrees, you're seeing decreases in southeast England. Now, these are results with CO2 fertilization. As some of you may know, that is uncertain. We don't know if that's really going to materialize. So results are also shown without CO2 fertilization. And in that case, the expected increases in yield are smaller. And there is also a lot of variation between the ensemble members. These are the results for ryegrass, and here again you can see large increases in yield projected as climate warms, but those increases are much less without CO2 fertilization. So I'm going to move on now to what about the changes in suitability of the land for growing different crops as the climate changes. And this is simulated using a model called EcoCrop that uses temperature, precipitation, and soil effects to determine the suitability of growing 182 different crops. And here you can see the results for maize. So this is a crop where there are considerable increases in the potential for growing the crop as the climate changes. So looking forward across the whole suite of 182 crops, the team isolated the 10 crops that had the greatest increases in suitability in different parts of the UK. So, for example, we have large increases potentially for buffalo bean and horseradish in Scotland, or cowpea in East Anglia, or stevia in the West Country. But of course, at the same time, there are also some losers. So we have kale, Brussels sprouts, strawberry and rhubarb highlighted as some of the losers. So how different is the future agricultural system under climate change? And the answer is very different, especially in some places. And this map attempts to capture an index of similarity between the future and the current crop communities. And in this particular graph, if there has been a change in the type of crop, then it is coloured dark blue. And if it is only a change from one very similar crop to another, from lentils to peas, it is not coloured. So what you can see here is that the areas in blue along the south coast and in that band going up to the north of the country have the greatest difference between the crop community of the future and the crop community of today. And that means, of course, that is where the greatest challenge to adaptation will be. An important caveat to all of this is that none of the interactions with other environmental factors are included. Drought is not fully captured. There could be interactions with water scarcity due to changes in populations and greater demands for water for other uses. And there are also large projected increases in pests and diseases accompanying climate change, which are not accounted for. And at the moment, we don't know to what extent those may offset these projected changes. So overall, it's a picture of dramatic change in the system. And these projected opportunities that I've shown will only be possible with a dramatic change in our agricultural system and the ability to deal with extreme events, pests and diseases. So coming on now to biodiversity, this is based on the Wallace Initiative, led by Jeff Price, which we developed some years ago under other funding. This is actually based on CMIP5 model projections, again extracting time slices for different levels of warming, but based on 21 alternative regional climate change projections. So just like the agricultural work, the uncertainty in regional climate change projection is accounted for. And in this element of the work, the climate projections were resampled to by 1 kilometre using elevational downscaling, and then overlaid over a land cover map, the one that the CH uses to get down to 20 by 20 metres. So our maps are very, very high resolution here. And the modelled range changes are for plants, invertebrates, vertebrates, fungi, and based on a model that relies on developing a statistical relationship between current species distributions and current climate, and then assuming that relationship holds into the future. So the first example result I'm going to show here is timber species. So where in the UK will it be possible to grow the tree crops that we use for timber? So what you can see here is on the left 2 degrees and on the right 4 degrees. So this is independent of SSP. And the darkest blue is showing the areas that are least affected, and the darkest brown is showing the areas that are mostly affected. So you see the least effects at 2 degrees in the north of Scotland, and the greatest with 50 to 60% loss of species that could be used in the southeast with 4 degrees of warming. The next slide is looking at the local extinction rate across all the species studied. How rapidly do species decline as climate warms? So this is looking at the species that are currently present in each grid cell, and then looking at whether the climate still remains suitable for that species in the future. But this work does not include the potential of species to move to new locations under climate change. And although vertebrates do have an ability to do that, invertebrates and plants, reptiles and amphibians often don't. And furthermore, the UK landscape is highly fragmented, and species can often not cross urban or agricultural areas. Also, all species are dependent on other species, and therefore, even if they do move, they might not be able to survive if species they've co-evolved with are no longer present. So what you can see here is... Okay, so in these maps, the agricultural areas are coloured white and the urban areas are coloured black. And then you can see the rate of extinction per half degrees warming, which is roughly linear, but this was taken by looking at the difference between 1.5 and 4 degrees and then averaging it. But what you can see here is that the areas that are most resilient are in the north of Scotland, and those that are losing species fastest are in the southeast. So then, if we extract from those the pollinator species, so many of our crops rely on pollinators, and this is looking at the projected loss in pollinators, and you can see this exceeds 50% in major agricultural parts of England, even at 2 degrees, and at 4 degrees this increases to 70% and extends over more of southern England and into Wales. So this is quite a serious issue and may compromise some of the opportunities that I showed in the earlier slides for agricultural crops. And lastly, I want to show you a more positive message, which is about biodiversity refugia. So where more than half of the models agree that the climate will be suitable for more than 3/4 of the species currently present, we call that a refugia, and we've mapped out where they are. And the darkest blue ones are refugia at 4 degrees. And the map on the left is showing the areas that are priorities for conservation, and that means they're already natural, they're currently suitable for biodiversity, and whereas the ones on the right are areas that are not that could be restored and are currently being used for agriculture. So left map conserve, right map potential restoration. And so that is where, in the absence of other priorities, you could conserve or restore in order to ensure the integrity of our ecosystems into the future. So I will now hand over to Paul to talk about flooding.
Excellent, thanks Rachel. And hello everyone. So, has that come up? Yep. So I'm Paul Sayers, and I'm going to be speaking about the focus on flooding, and particularly how we might start a more integrated approach to assessing natural flood management and its benefits. And the team, it's Sayers and Partners, but with Newcastle, led by Liz Lewis, and UEA with Helen He, and Samkar back at Sayers. I'm just going to see if I can increase the size of this screen. There we go. So for natural flood management, what do we think is the challenge? We know that there are multiple drivers. Flood risk is characterised by multiple drivers. It responds to multiple changes within the catchment. There are multiple responses of how we might respond to that flood risk, and that includes natural flood management, which in itself includes multiple things, woodlands and storage. But we see that as a core response, but it doesn't work alone. So even in our response, we can't just think of natural flood management alone. We have to think of it in the context of other activities. And both of those, if you like, the drivers of change in the catchment and our responses vary in space and time. So we've got quite a complicated picture of how things might change. And if we don't grapple with that interaction, then we're likely to start making the wrong choices, the wrong adaptation choices, make actions in the wrong place that have no benefit, or make actions in the wrong place that have knock-on impacts that we don't want. And it also is likely to lose the benefit of NFM within that more complex picture. So we have to grapple with those interactions. And that's really where OpenClim comes in. That allows us to start capturing all those complexities, at least in some extent, and how they are spatially varying and how they temporally vary, to start providing a new insight into natural flood management. So I'll just say a little bit now about how we've approached it. This is the general workflow that echoes the one that Robert showed earlier in general terms. And we're trying to bring these models together to say something new about natural flood management. And I'll just illustrate some of those external pressures that the catchment is facing. We've already heard that the SSPs translate to quite a strong variation in development as well as climate change. And these are some of the maps we saw earlier about the development changes. But there are also a whole bunch of other external, what I've called external pressures on the catchment that, again, OpenClim has been exploring that we try and bring forward. So we've got the pattern of urban development that we just heard about, how that changes in the future. But from Rachel, we've just heard that there's variation in where agricultural productivity is likely to increase or decrease with time. And we've heard from Rachel around the changes in conservation and restoration priorities. So where we think we want to conserve and where we think we want to restore as a priority is also varying. Now, all of those activities are important, but they're outside of flood management normally. So for us to think about flood management, we have to bring those together into some form of coherent catchment change, as we've called it. Some coherent catchment scenario that recognises all those external influences and recognises where we might choose to adapt and where the opportunities for natural flood management might be. So we've developed what we've called this coherent catchment scenario, and this is one of the outputs of that. We've called it the NFM max. So if we try and maximise those locations where we might do natural flood management, these are those places, taking into account some of those other pressures on the catchment. On the left, where we might look to implement storage, and on the right, where we might look to implement woodland. We are working on some other NFM versions that aren't just the max, but that is work in progress. So it's okay to have that idea of where we might do the storage and where we might undertake restoration for woodland, but we have to try and convert that into a hydrological response. And within OpenClim, there are two models being run, two hydrological models being run. SheTran, which is a physically based hydrological model that Liz Lewis and her team are running, and one is the HPV, a more conceptual model that Helen He is running. Now, both of those models represent the normal things that we might expect, catchment processes, evapotranspiration, routing, infiltration, etc. But we've had to think about how we modify those to represent natural flood management. And I thought I'd put up here of how it's done. It's always through proxies, really, in some form. And I thought I'd expose how we did it in the CCRA 3 if we included natural flood management in that. But that was really just based on case studies. So what have case studies shown about natural flood management? And we reflected that in the CCRA 3. But here, HPV and SheTran allow us means of doing it much more directly and spatially. So HPV does it by slowing the flow through modifying some of the conceptual parameters, and SheTran does it much more directly. And Steve Birkinshaw at Newcastle has been working on how you do it. Woodlands are relatively straightforward. Storage is more complicated, and storage is key for natural flood management, whether you can implement it, but it's much more difficult to represent. But we've got this idea of a leaky storage. So we incorporate a leaky storage where we see a storage opportunity that has a volume of storage and has a residence time within that storage. So how does that end up actually with changing the flows that we see, the hydrological response? And we can look at that with and without those NFN adaptations. And on the left, we see the reduction in the 10-year return period flows under a 2-degree future, and on the right, under a 4-degree future. So I think one of the interesting things is actually you see NFM having some additional potential from a flow reduction in a more extreme future. So in that 4-degree future, the map on the right, visually at least, it highlights that perhaps it's having more of a benefit in that setting than it is in a 2-degree future, both of which are important. Another advantage of OpenClim with these multi-models is you can start thinking about model uncertainty and whether you get different results with two different process models. So this graph is showing a comparison between the percentage change in the hydrological flow for the 10-year return period with different degrees of warning. The orange bar is from HBV and the blue bar from Shitran. HBV is fairly flat as warming increases and typically slightly more than Shitran. But in the Shitran model, we can see that the potential reduction in flow is increasing as climate change increases. So that blue bar is increasing to the right. Can you skip that one for purpose of time? Then we were looking to convert that, because hydrological flow response doesn't tell us necessarily that much about flood risk. There are other processes that we need to account for if we're going to translate that natural flood management adaptation flow change into some form of risk change. And there's a few things that are often important. Flood defences and how they perform, and sometimes even a really quite small change in flow can have quite a material impact in the way flood defences behave. So that's an important thing to represent. Exposure, where people are, is varying. So even though you might be changing flood flows a lot in this location, perhaps no one's there. So it depends on that interaction between where the flood flows are changing and where the people are is important. And also, often people say, well, NFM isn't going to do much for the very extreme events, which may be true, but risk doesn't respond to that sometimes. And from an expected annual damage case, it responds to how those much more frequent events are being managed. So we put that into the mix, into the model. The Future Flood Explorer captures those interactions, and we can start thinking about the change in risk. And what I'm going to show next is the project still going. So these are interim results. So with that caveat in mind, still, I think, useful to show. So what can we say about the role of natural flood management in flood risk at the GB scale? So I'm showing two sets of bar charts here. The brown are the 2-degree future and the reds are the 4-degree future. And the large bars are the whole portfolio of adaptation. So this is thinking about investment, defences, warning, the whole range of adaptations that we might normally consider, albeit a slightly reduced version of them. We're not, but a whole portfolio. And then on the right, the smaller bars are the NFM contribution. NFM Max is the one that we've run. The NFM Max contribution to that broader portfolio. You okay? Oh, sorry. Have I been playing to a blank screen? So the red bars are the NFM contribution to that adaptation portfolio. And it's quite significant. This is NFM Max, but nonetheless, it's quite significant. And interestingly, it gets bigger with a more extreme climate future. In England, we see a picture, and because England tends to dominate the GB risk, we see a similar type of pattern. In Scotland, we get quite a different picture. Now, notice the y-axis is a much smaller range. This is, unfortunately, a 1/6 of the range before, so they are a 6 smaller. I did originally keep them on the same axis, but you actually can't see the distinction there. So for Scotland, it's much smaller. Not only the adaptation overall portfolio benefits are smaller, as you'd expect, but the contribution that NFM makes to that adaptation contribution is smaller, which again is what you'd expect, because the opportunity for modifying the Scottish landscape through NFM is smaller. So those national bar charts don't tell us that it's not the same at all locations. So it's, and we have to look at the map to understand where are the real areas where reduction might be largest. So here we're looking at the percentage, the contribution of NFM in pounds to the adaptation effort. The darker the blue, the greater the NFM contribution to the pound reduction in risk through adaptation. And we can see that there are clear areas of the country that NFM is much more important for as part of the adaptation mix. And here we can also see it as a percentage of that adaptation effort. So in some places, adaptation reduces risk by a much bigger amount, so you'd expect NFM to be potentially bigger. But this map is showing us where NFM has the biggest percentage contribution to the adaptation effort. So it really highlights some of those places where we're expecting NFM to really be a core aspect of the overall portfolio. Okay, so what does all that lead to from emerging insights? Well, some policy insights, and I'm sure most people will agree with many of these in our community, but woodlands, soil, storage, fish, they are legitimate assets. They are legitimate flood risk assets that help us as part of that portfolio response. NFM has a potential to reduce the adaptation deficit, order of 10 to 20% across the country, more locally. And I haven't touched on it here, but the value of NFM goes obviously beyond flood risk into natural capital, which OpenClim will continue to think about going forward. Method insights. Well, I think the key one is to understand a proper flood risk management adaptation response. You have to think of how it's connected with the whole system response, not only NFM, but NFM within that context. And OpenClim is really starting helping us to understand that relationship. And next steps, well, there's 1,000 next steps, how long have you got? But I think we've really started building this quite powerful platform that we can start to use to explore advances in science, new models, and improving the underlying data sets. I think there really are strong possibilities here for hopefully we can take that forward into the next CCRA and beyond. Okay, thank you. Back to Richard.
Okay, thank you very much to all of my OpenClim colleagues for giving both excellent, informative and indeed on-time presentations. It's a great pleasure to welcome our final speaker to the stage, Professor Jim Hall from the University of Oxford, who has been the chair of our advisory board for the last few years and is going to offer some reflections on the role of OpenClim, or its potential role in supporting future national risk assessments. Jim, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Rich, and I know I'm keeping you from lunch, so I won't speak for long, but it's a great pleasure to be here, and I must really begin by congratulating the OpenClim team on getting to this point. I've been responsible for a few integrated modelling endeavours in my time, and I know what a challenge it is to pull everything together and get the types of results that we've just seen in this morning's presentation. So really, congratulations for that. As Rich said, I've been chair of the UK Climate Resilience Programme Steering Committee, and so UKCR is the overarching UKRI programme from which OpenClim and a large number of other projects have been funded. And as we were putting together the science plan for UK climate resilience, I really pushed super hard to have a significant integrated modelling capability as the centrepiece of the UK climate resilience programme. And so that is what OpenClim has become. And I think that's really important looking back on previous UK climate change risk assessments. We've just had the third, last year, the third climate change risk assessment. Each has been distinctive in its own way, but something of a frustration of that, and I sat on the adaptation committee for two of those risk assessments, was the stop-start feeling to doing climate change risk assessments. We pulled together a vast evidence base for the risk assessment, wrote a carefully worded report, distributed that and delivered it to government and then government to Parliament, and then heaved a big sigh of relief. And then a year or two later, it was time to start gearing up for the next one. And that was not a very efficient way of doing climate change risk assessments, and it didn't, I think, serve the country particularly well, having that element of stop-start. What OpenClim is here for is to move us towards a more continuous climate change risk assessment modeling capability which exists in perpetuity and can be updated and deliver new results for the CCRA, but also for all of the other users of climate risk information in the United Kingdom. And that continuous capability should and will then provide a shared platform which scientists across the country can input to and contribute to. OpenClim is open, the clue is in the name, and so it provides an open platform, an open source platform that scientists can input to, as Paul has just indicated, can put multiple models into and look at the implications of structural uncertainties as well as the extensive examination of parametric uncertainties, climatic uncertainties, which we've seen in this morning's presentation. Daphne, the data and analytics facility for national infrastructure, is absolutely central to that for a couple of reasons. First of all, because any integrated modeling activity which involves different teams in different universities in the way that OpenClim has requires some form of software hub which can enable coordination and integration of the different modeling capabilities. And if Daphne didn't exist, OpenClim would have had to have invented something like it to make it happen. And Daphne is proved to have that capability in a whole series of other integrated modeling contexts. Daphne is also important because it provides the legacy of reusability, also based on plenty of experience of previous research modeling projects. There's a risk that come the end of the project, there's what becomes of the legacy code, how does one keep it going, how do you maintain access to it within universities, people move on or think of exciting new questions to ask themselves. That's the nature of university research. So there needs to be a shared and perpetual platform where one can access all of the modeling capabilities, and that's what Daphne does. So I think we're in an exceptional position now to move towards CCRA 4, which has to be delivered in 2027. But the process of thinking about designing CCRA 4 is already well underway, and there's a lot of feedback has been received in relation to CCRA 3 and the ways in which people would wish to see CCRA 3 built upon and improved upon. Aspects of that which OpenClim is particularly relevant to is the continuing desire for more spatiality, for people to understand climate risks in particular places in a much more granular way, and OpenClim, as you've seen this morning, is delivering that. The other crucial thing, I think, in CCRA 4 is an even stronger sense of proportion. CCRA 3 had 61 risks were identified. Sometimes that felt a little bit overwhelming. And so as we go to CCRA4, we really need to build on the numbers, and some of these numbers you have to be quite cautious with. There's a lot of uncertainty, but notwithstanding the uncertainty, numbers give a sense of proportion. They tell you which of these risks are really big and should be top of the list, and which of them are important but are not quite on the same scale. And that's getting that really embedded in a very robust way in CCRA4, I think is super important. Of course, there are a number of other things that people have asked for in CCRA4 which are not really OpenClim's responsibilities, but are equally important. There's a call for much clearer adaptation goals, so a sense of what government is actually trying to achieve with respect to adaptation. Sometimes that's been a little bit vague. We're hoping for more of that sense of direction in the next National Adaptation Plan, which will come out this year. I think we're looking for a stronger sense of risk ownership and responsibilities for risks in CCRA4, and a more systematic analysis of policy levers. So what are the different ways in which government can actually manage risks? So there's a lot to do, and expectations are high, but the existence of OpenClim really provides an extremely important step in that direction. Of course, and you've already got a sense of this morning, OpenClim, as it stands right now, is not the last word. We've already seen plenty of work in progress, and this is a continuous journey. The UK Climate Resilience Programme funding is coming to an end, but there will be further funding coming through CCRA4 and other mechanisms, and so we need to think about the ways in which OpenClim can be taken forwards to provide this perpetual capability, which is what it's there for. But it really is a milestone in creation of this shared multi-purpose capability, and thanks to Daphne, and including further UKRI support for Daphne through the Building a Secure and Resilient World programme, OpenClim is certainly not going to die. Indeed, it's going to go from strength to strength. So thank you all, and congratulations.